Hello everyone. Tonight we are traveling back to one of the most intense corners of the ancient world, the dusty banks of the Tigris River, where the Assyrians first sharpened their ambitions. Picture this: you're sitting under a sweltering Mesopotamian sun, clay brick walls around you, the smell of barley beer drifting through narrow streets, and traders shouting about the price of lapis lazuli imported from far-off Afghanistan. It sounds exotic, right? Well, if you don't like heat, dust, and neighbors who occasionally raid your goats, then you probably would not survive a day in early Assyria. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. I'm not saying the Assyrians will come knocking if you don't, but they were known to enforce loyalty in some pretty creative ways. And if you're watching this, drop a comment with where you are and what time it is right now, because I love imagining this story being told to people all across the world at the same time. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. The rise of Assyria began not with enormous armies or towering palaces, but with a modest city-state named Ashur, nestled along the Tigris. Ashur was a trade hub where caravans and riverboats brought timber, tin, and textiles from distant lands. This city wasn't always destined to dominate the ancient Near East. In fact, for much of its early life, Assyria was overshadowed by its powerful neighbors Babylon to the south, the Hittites to the west, and various tribal confederations that kept things lively by raiding at inconvenient times. But something about the Assyrians stood out: their relentless organization and their almost obsessive drive to expand. Archaeologists have found that from very early on, their rulers carved inscriptions boasting about victories that were, let's just say, sometimes more optimistic than factual. You know how today some people inflate their resume? Well, in ancient Assyria, kings inflated their war reports. Historians still debate whether some of these victories were more creative writing than actual battlefield reports. One of the most striking features of Assyrian growth was the blending of trade and warfare. They didn't just conquer, they taxed, controlled trade routes, and turned rivers and roads into arteries of wealth. And let's be honest, if you wanted to survive in the ancient world, you needed money almost as much as muscle. The Assyrians had both, which is like showing up to the ancient Near East with cheat codes enabled. Of course, life in early Assyria wasn't just about grand strategy. Ordinary people worked fields of barley and wheat, raised sheep and goats, and brewed beer that, from all accounts, was thick enough to chew. Imagine sipping your dinner with a straught. Sounds strange, but Mesopotamians did exactly that, dipping long reeds into large communal jars. One Assyrian farmer, tired after a long day, probably looked at that muddy drink and thought, yes, this is civilization at its peak. And then there were the temples. The city of Ashur itself was named after the god Ashur, a stern deity who was essentially the Assyrian version of a national brand. The temple was not only a religious site, but also a symbol of collective identity. Assyrian kings claimed they acted as the god's chosen representatives, which conveniently justified every war, tax, and expansion they wanted to pursue. It's hard to argue with someone who says, "The god told me to do it." Now, let's talk about something odd. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets showing that Assyrians used donkey bones and odd mixtures of herbs in certain rituals. Why? Possibly for protection, possibly for magic, possibly because someone had too much free time with a pile of bones. Historians still debate whether these rituals were central to daily life or just fringe practices. Either way, it adds a spooky little detail to the otherwise practical Assyrian mindset. The early kings of Assyria were less like emperors and more like ambitious mayors with dreams far bigger than their city walls. They managed to extend influence over neighboring towns, often through trade agreements backed by military threats. You could say their diplomacy was like a smiling merchant with one hand on a contract and the other on a spear. Not the friendliest way to do business, but highly effective. As Assyria grew, so did its appetite. Each generation of rulers pushed a little farther, testing the limits of their small kingdom. And while some expansions failed rebellions, bad harvests, or the occasional angry neighbor, the overall trend was upward. Slowly but surely, Ashur was transforming from a city into the heart of something much larger. Here's your first little historical fun fact. Assyrians used to mark boundary stones called kudu. These weren't just dull blocks of rock. They were inscribed with curses to scare anyone who thought about moving them. One might read something like, May the gods strike down whoever shifts this stone. Honestly, I kind of wish modern property lines came with divine lightning threats. It would make real estate disputes much more entertaining. So, in summary, early Assyria was a mix of trade, war, faith, and just enough weird rituals to keep archaeologists guessing. It wasn't yet the terrifying empire that future kings would build, but the foundations were laid. The people of Ashur lived hard lives, farming, trading, brewing beer-thick smoothies, but their rulers were already dreaming of ironclad legacies. And while we think of the Assyrians today as brutal conquerors, in these first centuries, they were still the scrappy underdogs of Mesopotamia. That's the irony. The empire known for crushing rebellions and building siege towers started as just another city, trying not to get trampled by bigger players. But remember, every empire starts somewhere. For Assyria, it started with clay brick houses, the smell of barley beer, and the stubborn belief that they were destined for more. By the time Assyria began to stretch its arms beyond the city of Ashur, its rulers realized they needed more than ambition. They needed roads, walls, and of course, soldiers who didn't faint at the first sight of a desert sun. The Middle Assyrian period, roughly the 14th to 10th centuries BCE, was when things started getting serious. The small city-state was slowly morphing into something bigger, something scarier. The kings of this period were not just warlords, they were administrators, lawmakers, and occasional micromanagers who made your most controlling boss look laid back. One of the standout figures was King Ashurbanipal I, who decided that Assyria was done playing second fiddle to Babylon. Under his rule, Assyria declared itself an independent kingdom, and he wrote letters to other kings of the Near East, politely but firmly introducing himself as an equal. Imagine the awkwardness. "Hi, I know you're Pharaoh of Egypt and all, but we're important too. Sincerely, Assyria." This was the time when the Assyrians really refined their military. Soldiers wore bronze helmets, carried sturdy spears, and marched in disciplined ranks. They weren't quite the iron juggernauts of later centuries, but they were already developing a reputation for toughness. And unlike many neighbors, they didn't treat war as a seasonal hobby. Assyria fought year-round if necessary, which probably made their neighbors groan every time they saw dust clouds on the horizon. Now here's the odd detail. During this same period, Assyrians developed an elaborate set of laws that covered everything from property rights to family issues. Some of these laws were progressive, others, not so much. For instance, women in certain roles had rights to own property, which was surprisingly but if you violated some social rules, punishments could be, let's say, inventive. Historians still debate whether these laws were actually enforced to the letter, or if they were more like guidelines, because let's face it, even in ancient times, some rules were made to look scarier than they actually were. One law, for example, dictated that a woman caught misbehaving could have her ears cut off. Brutal, definitely. But whether this happened often, or was just a threat, is unclear. And yes, I know that sounds like the kind of policy that would make modern HR departments faint. But not everything was grim. Archaeological finds showed that Assyrian households had board games, with one called the Game of 20 Squares being especially popular. Picture it. Soldiers and scribes coming home after a long day of enforcing laws or marching through mud, only to relax by throwing dice and moving little counters across a carved board. It's a nice reminder that even fierce warriors enjoyed a bit of leisure, although knowing the Assyrians, losing a board game might have ended with a very tense silence. The Middle Assyrian kings also loved leaving records of their building projects. Clay tablets boast about walls being reinforced, temples being expanded, and canals dug to irrigate farmland. These projects weren't just practical, they were political statements. Every new canal was a way of saying, look how much we care for the people. Also, don't forget who paid for this canal. Speaking of canals, Assyrian engineers were already demonstrating a genius for controlling water. In a land where droughts and floods could ruin everything, the ability to redirect rivers was basically ancient superpower territory. And yes, while the Romans later bragged about aqueducts, the Assyrians were doing waterworks long before Rome was even a twinkle on the map. Let's not forget the temples. The god Ashur was still the headliner, but the Assyrians added more deities to their pantheon, blending local gods with influences from conquered peoples. Think of it as an ancient version of cultural fusion cuisine, sometimes delicious, sometimes confusing, and while priests performed rituals involving incense, offerings, and chants, we also find some bizarre references to protective charms made of clay figurines. One ritual even mentions burying tiny clay dogs under thresholds to guard against evil spirits. Historians still debate whether households really did this often, or if it was more of a ceremonial idea. Either way, I like the image of someone saying, "Don't mind the buried dogs, it's just good luck." Assyria's rise during this time wasn't smooth sailing. They clashed with the Mitanni, a powerful Hurrian kingdom, and eventually defeated them. They also traded blows with the Hittites and constantly squabbled with Babylon. Honestly, it was like living next to neighbors who kept throwing loud parties only instead of noise complaints. The Assyrians sent armies. And of course, there's room for a little humor here. One Middle Assyrian king proudly recorded that he conquered a city and brought back exotic animals, including monkeys. Just imagine the reaction of ancient Assyrians seeing monkeys for the first time, half amazed, half wondering how quickly they'd chew through temple decorations. So, the Middle Assyrian period gave us the first glimpse of Assyria as more than a scrappy city-state. It became a kingdom with real power, laws that could both terrify and surprise, and soldiers who weren't afraid to campaign in the heat of summer. It was still a few centuries away from becoming the empire everyone feared, but the groundwork was set. If the early Assyrians were ambitious dreamers, the Middle Assyrians were ambitious planners. They didn't just want survival anymore, they wanted control. And once you start dreaming of control in the ancient Near East, you're basically signing up for centuries of wars, alliances, betrayals, and the occasional monkey parade. By the dawn of the first millennium BCE, Assyria had already shed its skin as a modest kingdom and begun its transformation into a war machine that made neighbors tremble. This period is often called the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and if the earlier centuries were about laying foundations, this was the time of raising walls, sharpening blades, and spreading fear across the map. The new Assyrian kings were the kind of rulers who didn't just sit in their palaces, they bragged about how many cities they burned, how many kings they humiliated, and how much tribute they squeezed from distant lands. One of the early giants of this period was Tiglath-Pileser, whose very name sounds like a thunderclap. He expanded Assyrian control from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea, and he made it clear, this was not just another kingdom, this was becoming an empire. Assyria's military reforms were a big part of that transformation. By this time, they had begun to use iron weapons more extensively, giving them an edge, literally, over bronze-wielding rivals. They fielded armies with professional soldiers, cavalry units, and even siege engineers. Siege engines became their specialty: massive wooden towers, battering rams tipped with bronze, and ingenious ways of undermining walls. When you saw Assyria outside your city gates, you didn't say, "Maybe they'll go away." You said, "We need to start praying now." And here's an odd detail. Inscriptions describe how some conquered peoples were relocated en masse to other parts of the empire. To us, that sounds cruel, but the Assyrians thought it was smart governance. Moving troublesome populations away from their homelands meant less chance of rebellion, but it also created a strange patchwork of cultures. In some Assyrian cities, you might hear multiple languages in the marketplace, see different clothing styles, and smell unfamiliar foods cooking on street corners. Imagine Babylonian stews next to Aramean flatspreads, with Egyptian perfumes on sale to stalls. Over it was a strange kind of empire-wide fusion. Of course, not everything was grim. Archaeology gives us glimpses of Assyrian luxury at this time. Kings boasted of lush gardens filled with exotic plants brought from far-off lands. Some even claimed to have imported cedars from Lebanon and fruit trees from across the Near East. And yes, one inscription brags about keeping exotic animals in enclosures, basically the earliest royal zoos. Historians still debate whether one king really kept lions and ostriches together in a hunting park. But if true, I'd pay to see the ostriches trying to outrun Assyrian arrows. Tiglath-Pileser and his successors were also very keen on records. Clay tablets described not just wars, but also hunting trips. One king proudly wrote about killing wild bulls and lions. And I have to admit, reads a little like ancient Instagram bragging. Just another day in the royal park, spearing lions, #KingLife. The Assyrians also pioneered what might be called terror marketing. Their inscriptions didn't just record victories, they exaggerated them in blood-curdling detail. They wanted their enemies to read these records and think, "Nope, not messing with that." In a way, they understood psychological warfare before the term even existed. One chilling line in an inscription describes hanging enemy corpses on city walls, but historians still debate whether this was standard practice or royal exaggeration meant to scare everyone into submission. Personally, I suspect it was 50% real, 50% propaganda, and 100% nightmare fuel. Yet, amid all this iron and terror, Assyrian society was functioning. Merchants thrived in bustling markets, artisans carved intricate ivories, and scribes carefully copied texts onto clay. One odd but delightful discovery is a fragment of an ancient recipe, tablet apparently listing ingredients for stews and sauces. So yes, while the kings bragged about lions and bloodshed, someone in Assyria was perfecting the world's first cookbook. And honestly, who doesn't appreciate a good lamb stew after a long campaign? Let's also not forget the humor in this. Imagine being an Assyrian scribe tasked with writing the king's glorious achievements, day after day, chiseled to clay, inscribing long lists of victories. You'd probably slip in a sigh or two. Yes, my lord, I'll write that you killed 10,000 enemies again. But couldn't we also mention that you liked board games? Sadly, no board game mentions made it into royal inscriptions, but archaeologists did find them in homes. The same game of 20 squares was still popular, a quiet reminder that life wasn't all war and conquest. By the end of this period, Assyria was no longer a regional power. It was a superpower. Its armies reached the Mediterranean, its merchants traded far and wide, and its kings were feared in every palace from Egypt to Elam. But with great power came great instability. Each new king had to prove himself in battle, which meant that the empire was constantly at war. And as you might imagine, perpetual war is great for keeping soldiers busy, but terrible for long-term peace. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was on the rise, and the world was starting to realize that nothing would be the same. Neighboring kingdoms could either pay tribute, fight desperately, or prepare to be relocated, and somewhere in the palace, an Assyrian king was already sharpening his spear, polishing his inscriptions, and making sure future historians would never forget his name even if they weren't sure whether half of it really happened. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria had shaken off any doubts about its destiny and stepped fully into its role as the hammer of the ancient Near East. If earlier kings had laid the groundwork, this was the age of builders, conquerors, and men who seemed to believe that the gods had chosen them specifically to terrify their neighbors. And leading the charge was Ashurnasirpal II, a name that probably kept other rulers awake at night. Ashurnasirpal wasn't content to just hold on to what his ancestors had won. He wanted more, much more. His campaigns stretched across Mesopotamia and into the Levant, pushing westward toward the Mediterranean. Cities fell like dominoes, and kings who hesitated to pay tribute quickly learned that hesitation was a very bad policy when Assyria came knocking. He also moved the Assyrian capital to a new location, Kalhu modern Nimrud. This wasn't just a military decision, it was a statement. Kalhu became a showcase of imperial power, filled with massive palaces, temples, and monuments. Archaeologists later uncovered colossal winged bulls Lamosuth guarded palace gates with their stern faces and curling beards. Imagine walking past one of those every day. Even the palace janitors probably felt nervous. And here's the strange, almost funny part. Ashurnasirpal celebrated the opening of his new capital with what may have been history's largest catered party. Inscribed records boast that he invited almost 70,000 guests for a 10-day feast. The menus listed thousands of sheep, cattle, deer, fish, and rivers of wine and beer. It was so massive that historians still debate whether the numbers were exaggerated, or if Kalhu briefly turned into a giant ancient food festival. Picture it. Nobles sipping from golden cups while some poor cook frantically tries to keep track of 10,000 loaves of bread. Of course, Ashurnasirpal's empire wasn't just about food and architecture. His reign was marked by relentless war. He was notorious for brutality, at least according to his own inscriptions. Sometimes you wonder whether he actually did everything he claimed, or if he just wanted future readers to say, "Wow, what a terrifying guy." It's like the version of padding your resume, except his padding involved more severed heads than internships. One odd but telling detail is that Ashurnasirpal claimed divine support for every action, whether he was building a temple, expanding territory, or even planting exotic gardens. It was always with the favor of the gods. And yes, those gardens were another royal obsession. Exotic plants were transplanted from conquered lands, turning Kalhu into a living museum of nature. Later, Greek writers even claim that Assyrian kings built elevated gardens watered by canals, details that some argue might connect to the famous Hanging Gardens. Historians still debate whether those gardens existed in Assyria, Babylon, or anywhere at all. Daily life under his reign was more complex than the royal inscriptions suggest. In Kalhu, artisans produced delicate ivory carvings, merchants traded goods from Phoenicia and Egypt, and scribes filled libraries with cuneiform texts. Some tablets record omens and astrological predictions. Assyrians believed that the movement of the stars could influence the fate of kings, so court astrologers were basically the high-paid consultants of their day. If Mercury was in retrograde, you can bet someone was nervously advising the king not to launch a new campaign. Meanwhile, the army was evolving into a professional force, not just a collection of conscripts. Cavalry units became more prominent, replacing older chariot warfare. They even experimented with chain-of-command structures, making their forces more organized than most rivals. And because Assyrians loved efficiency, they were quick to adopt and adapt new technologies from conquered peoples. Siege engines improved, armor became sturdier, and communications through relay systems helped armies move faster across vast territories. Yet, even with all this power, Ashurnasirpal's reign reveals the contradictions of empire. He wanted to be both the terrifying conqueror and the generous host. He was both destroyer and builder, ruthless in war and lavish in peace. The grand feast at Kalhu was not just about food, it was political theater, proving that Assyria could conquer, but also provide, entertain, and impress. If you left that feast full and tipsy, you were also leaving with a clear message: don't mess with Assyria. And here's a lighter thought. Imagine the cleanup. After 70,000 guests, somewhere in the shadows of Kalhu, exhausted servants probably muttered that they'd rather face an enemy army than wash another platter. By the end of Ashurnasirpal II's reign, Assyria was not just feared, it was admired, envied, and grudgingly respected. His son would inherit a stronger empire, a dazzling capital, and an army that was the envy of the ancient world. But he'd also inherit the weight of keeping it all together. Because once you set the standard of being the scariest guy around, you can't exactly start throwing garden parties without the conquest part. The empire was only just beginning its climb toward its golden age, and the kings who followed would push Assyria even further into heights of power that would make the rest of the ancient Near East tremble. When Ashurnasirpal II passed the throne to his son, Shalmaneser III, one thing was certain: the Assyrian war machine wasn't going to slow down. If anything, it was like handing the keys of a Ferrari to someone who had just discovered the joy of speeding. Shalmaneser inherited a stronger empire, a polished capital, and an army that was basically the ancient world's version of a Swiss army knife, sharp and slightly terrifying. From the very beginning of his reign, Shalmaneser III was restless. Campaigns rolled out year after year, so often that even his royal scribes probably groaned whenever he announced a new one. By the end of his rule, he had reportedly led over 30 military campaigns, striking fear into every corner of the Near East. If you lived near the Euphrates or the Levant during his time, you probably got really tired of seeing Assyrian banners on the horizon. One of his most famous campaigns brought him face to face with a coalition of kings at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. It was a who's who of the ancient world: Arameans, Phoenicians, Israelites, and others, all banding together to stop Assyria's expansion. Imagine the awkwardness: rivals who had hated each other for generations, suddenly shaking hands just to avoid being steamrolled. Even King Ahab of Israel, usually known for other biblical matters, made an appearance with a contingent of chariots. Historians still debate who really won the battle. Shalmaneser's inscriptions proudly claim victory, of course, but the fact that he had to keep returning to the region suggests that the locals didn't exactly roll out the red carpet afterward. Back home, Shalmaneser wasn't just about swords and spears, he also loved monuments. He ordered the building of the Black Obelisk, one of the most remarkable Assyrian artifacts discovered. This tall, carved stone column depicts scenes of tribute from various rulers, including a famous image of an Israelite king bowing before him. That piece of art has survived millennia, meaning Shalmaneser achieved what every influencer dreams of: a lasting brand image. And here's a quirky detail: while the inscriptions highlight battles and tributes, some also mention strange astronomical observations. During his reign, scribes recorded a solar eclipse in 763 BC. which later became a key marker for dating events in the ancient Near East. Picture that while armies clashed and kings quarreled, someone in Assyria was squinting at the sky, scribbling notes that would help future historians build timelines. It's the kind of accidental homework that turned into a gift for modern scholars. Of course, life under Shalmaneser wasn't just marching armies and celestial events. His reign lasted over 3 decades, and the longer he ruled, the more cracks began to appear. Toward the end, rebellions broke out, even inside Assyria itself, led by none other than his own sons. Imagine being so intimidating abroad, yet struggling to get respect at home. It's like being the scariest guy in the neighborhood, but still grounded by your kids. Yet, despite these internal struggles, Shalmaneser managed to leave behind a record of unprecedented expansion. His constant campaigning pushed Assyria's influence deeper into Anatolia, the Levant, and even toward Babylon. The tribute he collected wasn't just money, it was goods, exotic animals, and even skilled workers. Kalhu must have felt like an international bazaar at times, buzzing with craftsmen and merchants from every corner of the known world. Daily life in Assyria during this period reflected that prosperity. Art flourished, with detailed bronze reliefs showing battle scenes and hunting expeditions. Hunting lions became a royal pastime, not just for sport, but as a staged demonstration of dominance over chaos. And yes, that meant real lions were released for the king to fight, something that sounds impressive, until you realize someone else had to be in charge of catching and transporting the lions first. Probably not the most popular job posting. The Assyrian army, meanwhile, continued to evolve. Siege warfare grew more sophisticated, and cavalry tactics improved. Shalmaneser's campaigns brought in horses from regions like Anatolia, creating a stronger, faster mounted force. If earlier armies had been impressive, his forces were becoming a true juggernaut, one that would shape how warfare was fought across the region. Despite all this power, one thing is clear: Shalmaneser's reign marked both the peak of relentless expansion and the beginning of visible strain. His kingdom was vast, but not all of it was stable. The rebellions late in his reign hinted at the challenges of ruling such a sprawling empire. After all, you can only stretch your armies and resources so thin before something snaps. Still, Shalmaneser III's legacy was secure. He was remembered as a conqueror, a builder of monuments, and a ruler whose campaigns became the stuff of legend. And even though historians debate whether his battles were as one-sided as his inscriptions claim, no one doubts that under him, Assyria was one of the most powerful forces the ancient Near East had ever seen. As his reign ended, the empire didn't collapse, but it did wobble. The sons who once rebelled would pass their quarrels down, leaving future kings to wrestle with both foreign enemies and domestic politics. The stage was being set for the next great chapter, where Assyria would not only recover, but ascend to an even more terrifying golden age. And just think, if you had lived under Shah, you might have spent your mornings working in a bustling marketplace, your afternoons hearing rumors of another war, and your evenings looking up nervously at the sky, wondering if the eclipse meant the gods were trying to tell you something. The death of Shalmaneser III left Assyria both powerful and vulnerable. For decades, the empire had been like a fire blazing across the Near East, hot, destructive, impossible to ignore. But when he was gone, the flames flickered. His successors inherited not only vast lands and tribute, but also a messy family legacy of rebellion and rivalry. The immediate transition wasn't smooth. His son Shamshi-Adad took the throne, but he had already been part of the rebellion against his father. Imagine inheriting a kingdom after spending years trying to break it apart. It wasn't the cleanest start. Shamshi-Adad spent much of his reign putting out fires, both literally and figuratively. Rebellions had to be crushed, vassal states needed resubdued, and Syrian scribes probably grew tired of carving loyalty restored onto stone tablets. Though not as flashy a conqueror as his father, Shamshi-Adad held things together. He kept the empire from falling apart, though he didn't expand it much further. His reign was more about damage control than glory. But sometimes stability is a victory in itself, especially when your nobles and generals are eyeing the throne like hungry wolves. His queen, Shemaramat, deserves special mention. Known later in legend as Semiramis, she played a remarkable role during and after her husband's reign. After Shamshi-Adad's death, she acted as regent for their young son, Adad-Nirari III. The idea of a woman holding power in Assyria was extraordinary. Though the records are vague, later traditions blew her memory into myth. crediting her with building cities, waging wars, and even founding empires. Whether exaggerated or not, the fact that her name lived on in so many legends shows just how striking her presence must have been. Under Adad-nirari III, Assyria tried to regain its momentum. As he grew older and took the reins himself, he launched campaigns into Syria and the Levant. He managed to make Damascus, a major regional power, pay tribute. For a while, things looked promising. The empire was back on the offensive. The tribute was flowing again, and Assyria's dominance seemed secure. But cracks were forming in the foundations. The biggest problem wasn't enemies abroad, it was weak kings at home. After Adad-nirari, a series of rulers took the throne who lacked the drive or charisma of earlier conquerors. Names like Shalmaneser IV Oshadan III and Oshanari V appear in the king lists, but their reigns read more like a slow slide than a dramatic story. Instead of bold campaigns and massive conquests, the records are filled with mentions of plagues, eclipses, and revolts. The empire's borders began to shrink. Vassal states sensed weakness and slipped away. Assyria's once mighty army, the terror of the region, now found itself struggling to enforce obedience. Neighboring powers like Urartu in the north and the Aramean states to the west took advantage of the lull, biting at Assyria's edges. Inside the heartland, life was uneasy. The capital cities, once booming with tribute and spoils of war, saw leaner times. Taxes increased, but without the steady stream of loot from foreign campaigns, the burden fell harder on the local population. Farmers in the Assyrian heartland had to feed not just themselves, but an empire in decline. It was a fragile balance. Then came the plagues. Several kings mention them in their inscriptions, often paired with eclipses, ominous signs that the gods might be turning away. In a society where divine favor was everything, disasters like these weren't just natural events, they were warnings. Priests, diviners, and astrologers would have been in high demand, trying to read the heavens for clues on how to appease the gods. For nearly a century, Assyria limped along, no longer the unstoppable juggernaut of Shalmaneser's day. This period is often called the Middle Assyrian Dark Age, a time when the empire was weak, vulnerable, and unsure of its future. But here's the twist. The story didn't end there, because history loves a comeback. The Assyrians weren't gone, just dormant. The institutions of empire, the bureaucracy, the military traditions, the system of tribute and governors remained in place, even if under strain, and eventually, a new generation of kings would rediscover the fire that once drove their ancestors. The Assyrian war machine would roar back to life, sharper and more ruthless than ever. But during this quieter century, life, for ordinary Assyrians, might have felt almost normal. Markets still bustled, fields still needed plowing, temples still echoed with prayers. People married, raised children, and tried to ignore the sense that their empire was no longer invincible. It was a reminder that behind all the inscriptions boasting of victories and conquests, there were millions of everyday lives caught in the tides of history. By the late 8th century BCE, though whispers of change were in the air, a new king was rising, one with the energy and ambition to drag Assyria out of its slump. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III, and he was about to reinvent the empire, turning it into something far deadlier than before. By the mid-8th century BCE, Assyria was like a once great athlete, now sitting in the stands, overweight, grumpy, and ignored by younger competitors. Neighboring states like Urartu in the north strutted around like they owned the place, and petty kingdoms in Syria barely bothered paying tribute anymore. The empire was still there in name, but its reputation as the unstoppable war machine had faded. That's when Tiglath-Pileser III stepped into the arena and history, decided to give Assyria a second act. Tiglath-Pileser wasn't content with merely patching the old empire. He reinvented it. His reign, beginning around 745 BCE, marked the Neo-Assyrian revival, a period when Assyria went from shaky has-been to terrifying superpower once more. Unlike some earlier kings, who inherited the throne without much fuss, Tiglath-Pileser may have seized power through a coup. If so, he clearly made the most of it. After all, who doesn't love a good comeback story, preferably one written in blood, bronze, and bureaucracy? One of his greatest innovations was restructuring the empire itself. Instead of relying on local vassals, who had a bad habit of rebelling, the second the king turned his back, Tiglath-Pileser created directly governed provinces. This meant loyal Assyrian officials, not suspicious local rulers, were in charge of collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and reporting back to Nineveh. Basically, he turned the empire from a loose confederation into a centralized state. Bureaucrats everywhere probably sighed with relief and then immediately got buried under paperwork. He also revolutionized the army. The old model relied heavily on conscripts, farmers called up to fight when needed. That worked fine when wars were short. But in an empire where campaigns stretched across deserts and mountains, it was unsustainable. Tiglath-Pileser introduced the first standing army in Assyria. Paid soldiers, including foreign mercenaries and specialists, were always ready for action. The result? A professional force that could wage year-round campaigns and keep conquered lands under tighter control. Imagine being a small border kingdom, hoping Assyria would be too busy harvesting crops to invade. Bad news. The Assyrians now had soldiers who didn't even own farms. With these changes in place, Tiglath-Pileser launched a series of brutal and effective campaigns. He smashed Urartu's ambitions in the north, subdued rebellious Aramean tribes, and extended Assyrian power deep into Syria and even Palestine. Whole populations were uprooted and deported, a chilling but effective policy. Instead of killing everyone messy, bad for taxes, he moved conquered peoples to new lands, scattering them so they couldn't organize rebellions. It was social engineering on an imperial scale, and while it sounds cold-blooded, it kept the empire stable for generations. One of the strangest details from this era is how much astrology influenced political decisions. The Assyrians believed the stars and planets revealed the god's will. When an eclipse occurred, kings sometimes went into hiding, appointing a temporary substitute king who would symbolically absorb any divine wrath. Can you imagine being told, "Congratulations, you're king for a month, also, the gods might kill you"? Historians still debate how literally this was carried out, but it's one of those delightful weird quirks of ancient politics. Tiglath-Pileser's expansion also brought Assyria into closer contact with Israel and Judah. Biblical accounts mention his campaigns, including taking tribute from kings in the Levant. For Assyria, this was business as usual, another region folded into the tax machine. For the local populations, it was a terrifying reminder that Assyria was back, stronger than ever. Of course, not everything was serious statecraft. One tablet records Tiglath-Pileser boasting about eating a ridiculous number of roasted ducks during a feast. It's oddly comforting to know that even one of history's most feared conquerors still had cheat days. By the time of his death, Tiglath-Pileser had transformed Assyria into a lean, mean imperial machine. The empire was larger, richer, and more organized than it had ever been before. His successors inherited a state that was ready to dominate the Near East for the next century. Yet beneath the triumphs lurked a darker truth. All these reforms made the empire incredibly powerful, but also incredibly dependent on constant conquest. Like a shark that has to keep swimming to survive, Assyria had to keep expanding to feed its machine. Tribute, plunder, and manpower kept the empire alive, and stopping meant collapse. The stage was set for even more ambitious kingsmen like Sargon II and Sennacherib II, pushed the empire to new, terrifying heights. But before we get to them, let's pause and appreciate this turning point. The Assyrians had been written off, counted out, mocked as yesterday's power. And yet, through sheer will and ruthless innovation, Tiglath-Pileser III turned them into a juggernaut again. It's the kind of comeback story that makes you root for them, right? Until you remember that their happy ending usually involved burning your city and deporting your family. After Tiglath-Pileser III set the empire back on its feet, his successors wasted no time flexing Assyria's muscles. But then came Sargon II, a king who quite literally tried to write himself into legend. He wasn't just another Assyrian monarch, he was a man determined to redefine kingship itself, all while juggling conspiracies, rebellions, and a healthy dose of paranoia. Now, let's start with the obvious question. Why Sargon II? Well, the name was no accident. The original Sargon, centuries earlier, had been the founder of the mighty Akkadian Empire. By taking the same name, Sargon II was making a bold claim. Hey, I'm not just a king, I'm a reborn founder, destined to rule the world. Modesty clearly wasn't his strong suit. Historians still debate whether he came to the throne through legitimate succession or by elbowing aside rivals in a good old-fashioned palace coup. Either way, once he had the crown, he wasn't giving it up. One of Sargon's defining moments was his campaign against the kingdom of Urartu. Perched up in the mountains of modern-day Armenia, Urartu had long been a thorn in Assyria's side. They weren't just troublesome neighbors, they were genuine rivals for control of the Near East. Sargon marched his armies into the harsh northern terrain, facing not just soldiers but avalanches, freezing winds, and mountain passes where one wrong step meant tumbling to your doom. The victory he eventually claimed over Urartu wasn't just military, it was personal. He wanted to show the world that Assyria had no equal. But while he was out winning glory, trouble brewed closer to home. The western provinces rebelled, Babylon resisted as always, and palace whispers kept him awake at night. One odd practice during his reign involved haruspicy, the reading of animal entrails to predict the future. Imagine a king about to decide foreign policy, staring at sheep livers and asking, "So, should we invade or not?" Assyrian priests took this very seriously, sketching detailed diagrams of organs to interpret divine signs. Historians still debate whether these rituals genuinely guided strategy or simply gave nervous kings a cosmic excuse when things went wrong. Speaking of Babylon, Sargon's relationship with the city was complicated. He presented himself as a liberator at times, claiming to honor Babylonian gods and traditions, but his presence was resented, and revolts erupted frequently. Babylon was like that one roommate who insists on sharing everything but then locks their door when you need to borrow toothpaste. Assyria couldn't ignore it, but neither could it ever fully control it. Then there's the bizarre and fascinating detail about Sargon's obsession with building a new capital city. Nineveh and Kalhu weren't enough. He wanted something uniquely his. Thus was born Dur-Sharrukin, fortress of Sargon, built from scratch in Mesopotamia. It was a massive complex of palaces, temples, gardens, and colossal winged bulls carved in stone. The city was planned with such precision that modern archaeologists still marvel at its layout. It was essentially the Assyrian version of moving into a flashy new mansion just to prove you've made it. And yet, here's the kicker. Sargon never got to fully enjoy his glittering new city. In 705 BCE, he died in battle, an unusual and embarrassing end for an Assyrian king. His body was never recovered, which in Mesopotamian belief was a cosmic disaster. Without a proper burial, his soul was thought to wander restlessly, never at peace. Imagine building yourself the ultimate palace, only for your ghost to be cursed to haunt the desert instead. Historians still debate the details of that campaign, and whether his death was due to poor planning, treachery, or simply bad luck. Sargon's reign, however, left an enormous impact. His military conquests stretched Assyria's reach farther than ever before. His administrative reforms tightened the empire's grip, and his architectural legacy gave archaeologists endless photo ops centuries later. But his death also revealed a recurring theme in Assyrian history. The bigger the empire grew, the more fragile it became. Constant expansion meant constant strain, and a single loss could shake the very foundations of power. One humorous tidbit from Sargon's records is how often he boasted about the sheer volume of tribute he collected: gold, silver, horses, camels, spices, and even exotic monkeys. Yes, somewhere in the Assyrian court, there were probably monkeys scampering around, while scribes tried to take notes. Just picture the king's royal audience constantly interrupted by banana theft. By the end of his reign, Sargon too had made sure that his name, whether by fear or fascination, would never be forgotten. But his ghostly fate and unfinished legacy paved the way for his son, a man whose name would be remembered across millennia. And trust me, you'll want to remember him, if only for the time he decided to pick a fight with Jerusalem. When Sargon II fell in battle and vanished without a proper burial, the empire was left with a curse hanging over Aitor. At least, that's how the Assyrians saw it. Enter his son Sennacherib, a man who was equal parts brilliant, terrifying, and, dare I say, stubborn to the point of comedy. If Sargon had been the empire's architect, Sennacherib was the empire's bulldozer. He didn't just inherit an empire, he inherited every single problem his father had left unfinished. And oh boy, did he handle those problems in his own unique way. One of his first orders of business was dealing with Babylon, that eternal thorn in Assyria's royal backside. Babylon had revolted against shocking Ino, and Sennacherib's patience for it wore thin. Instead of the usual policy of conquer, install a puppet king, wait for rebellion, repeat, he eventually decided on something far more dramatic: the total destruction of Babylon. He didn't just sack it, he ordered its temples, palaces, and walls torn down. The city flooded, and its memory wiped off the map. Imagine deleting your neighbor's entire house because they played their lute too loud one night. Historians still debate whether this act was born of pure rage or calculated strategy, but it certainly left Babylon in ruins until, of course, later kings tried to rebuild it. But before his Babylonian temper tantrum, Sennacherib had already made headlines with his famous campaign against Judah. The year was 701 BC, and the Assyrian army marched into the Levant, steamrolling fortified cities and terrifying smaller kingdoms. King Hezekiah of Judah had dared to rebel, and Sennacherib was not about to let that go unpunished. His siege of Jerusalem became one of the most legendary encounters in biblical history. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Assyrian records proudly boast of trapping Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. It's the ancient equivalent of a trash talk tweet. But the story in local traditions suggests that something miraculous or perhaps just coincidental saved the city. Some say plague ravaged the Assyrian army. Others suggest poor supply lines or an unlucky turn of events. Historians still debate whether divine intervention or logistical failure forced Sennacherib to retreat. But one thing's clear: Jerusalem survived, and Hezekiah, birdcage or not, lived to sing another hymn. Let's pause here for a weird off-topic detail. During Sennacherib's reign, the Assyrians improved their engineering to such an extent that they built elaborate canals, aqueducts, and irrigation systems. They even diverted entire rivers to bring water into their cities. One inscription brags about a canal carved through solid rock for miles. Another mentions an aqueduct that looks suspiciously like a forerunner of Roman engineering centuries later. So while Sennacherib was busy burning Babylon, he was also essentially designing Mesopotamian plumbing. Speaking of designing, his obsession with Nineveh deserves its own spotlight. He transformed the old city into the jewel of the empire, constructing massive palaces, lush gardens, colossal walls, and towering gates. Some historians even speculate that these gardens, watered by his ingenious canals, might have inspired later tales of the hanging gardens of Babylon. Imagine building something so impressive that people forget where it even was and give your neighbor the credit. That's ancient PR for you. Now, let's sprinkle in some humor. Sennacherib was a man who loved to brag. His inscriptions read like a laundry list of "look what I did today." He counted enemy casualties, listed tribute down to the last sheep, and described the terror his enemies felt in colorful detail. You can almost imagine him as the guy who constantly updates his status. Just conquered 46 cities. LOL. #winning. If Assyrian kings had TikTok, his feed would have been terrifying. But bragging aside, there was always something uneasy about Sennacherib's reign. His ruthless efficiency and his destruction of Babylon made him both feared and despised. Even within his own palace, whispers grew. And here's where fate decided to have some fun with irony. Despite all his power, Sennacherib eventually fell not to an enemy army, but to a conspiracy within his own family. His sons, angry, ambitious, and possibly fueled by his favoritism for another heir, murdered him. Yes, the man who once flooded Babylon was undone in his own temple by his own blood. Talk about a bad family reunion. Sennacherib's death left the throne open to one of the most fascinating rulers in Assyrian history. A man who would try to balance destruction with diplomacy, cruelty with grandeur. His name was Esarhaddon, and his story shows us just how unpredictable the empire could be. But before we move on, let's not forget, without Sennacherib, Nineveh might never have become the shining capital we picture today. And without Nineveh, archaeologists would have far fewer Instagrammable ruins. Esarhaddon entered the stage like a man walking barefoot across hot coals, every step cautious, every move carefully planned, and every glance over his shoulder reminding him of how his father, Sennacherib, had ended his days murdered by his own sons. Family dinners in Assyria were not exactly cheerful affairs, yet despite the curse that seemed to haunt the royal line, Esarhaddon rose above the blood-soaked chaos and managed to rule with a strange mix of ruthlessness and mercy. If Sennacherib had been the destroyer of Babylon, Esarhaddon decided he would be its restorer, and that contradiction defined much of his reign. His first major act was bold, rebuilding Babylon. After his father had razed it to the ground, in a fit of fury, Esarhaddon took the opposite approach, pouring resources, manpower, and royal attention into reviving the great city. He ordered the temples restored, the walls rebuilt, and the sacred statues recast. For many Babylonians, this was like watching a hated stepfather replaced by a surprisingly generous heir. It was as if Esarhaddon wanted to erase the memory of his father's vengeance and replace it with his own vision of harmony. Historians still debate whether this was political savvy or genuine respect for Babylonian culture. But either way, it worked at least for a time, and while he was busy playing city planner, he also had to deal with the usual Assyrian pastime, warfare. His eyes turned westward and southward, where Egypt was flexing its muscles again under the rule of the Kushite pharaohs. For centuries, Assyria and Egypt had been like two heavyweight champions pacing around the same ring, eyeing each other with suspicion. Esarhaddon decided it was time to throw a punch. In 671 BCE, he launched a daring campaign into Egypt, a move that stunned the ancient world. Crossing deserts, enduring brutal heat, and managing logistics that would make any modern general sweat, the Assyrian army pressed forward. Against the odds, Esarhaddon's forces captured Memphis, the Egyptian capital, sending Pharaoh Taharqa running south. For a brief moment, Assyria could boast of controlling both Mesopotamia and Egypt, a feat no king before him had achieved. It was the empire at its widest reach, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Nile, and if you're imagining Esarhaddon smiling smugly at a world map, you wouldn't be far off. But of course, victories never came without quirks. One odd detail preserved in records is that during the Egyptian campaign, Esarhaddon apparently carried a special protective amulet wherever he went, convinced it shielded him from curses and evil spirits. Ancient rulers were often obsessed with omens, dreams, and protective charms, and Esarhaddon was no exception. Some historians whisper that his near-constant fear of illness and betrayal made him cling to rituals more tightly than most. Humor break. Picture the great king of Assyria, conqueror of Egypt, standing in full battle armor but nervously checking if his lucky amulet was still around his neck. That's like Superman pausing mid-fight to make sure his socks match. Back at home, Esarhaddon wasn't just a warrior, he was also a builder and dreamer. Nineveh continued to grow under his supervision, filled with temples, gardens, and monuments. He was determined to outshine his predecessors, not just by force of arms, but by leaving behind something lasting. He even started work on a magnificent new palace, though fate wouldn't let him enjoy it for long. And here's where the curse of Assyria struck again. Esarhaddon suffered from poor health throughout his life. Some texts describe him as frail, plagued by mysterious illnesses, and constantly worried about his mortality. While his empire stretched wider than ever, his own body betrayed him. His advisors and doctors prescribed all kinds of remedies, some involving plants, some involving chants, and some so bizarre they might as well have come from a cookbook of magical recipes. Historians still debate whether his death was natural, accelerated by disease, or simply the weight of ruling such a vast realm pressing down on him. Still, Esarhaddon wasn't naive. He knew the dangers of succession all too well. Determined to prevent another blood-soaked palace coup, he carefully arranged for his sons' futures. To one, he gave Babylon. To the other, Ashurbanipal, he granted Assyria itself. This was like dividing a kingdom between two lions and hoping they wouldn't bite each other's tails. Strangely enough, the plan worked, at least for a while. And so, when Esarhaddon died in 669 BCE, on his way to Egypt for yet another campaign, his carefully laid plans set the stage for one of the most famous rulers of the ancient world. Ashurbanipal, the man who would soon become the last great king of Assyria, stepped forward with the confidence of a ruler who believed knowledge and war could coexist. Esarhaddon might not have had the flair of Sennacherib or the terror of Tiglath-Pileser, but his reign stitched together the empire's wounds and pushed its boundaries farther than ever before. He was the quiet conqueror, the cautious dreamer, and the anxious king who rebuilt what others had burned. And while he may have clutched his amulet too tightly, he also left behind something stronger, a dynasty poised for one last blaze of glory. If Esarhaddon was the careful restorer, then his son Ashurbanipal was the empire's showman king, who managed to be both a ruthless warrior and a self-proclaimed scholar. His reign, beginning in 669 BCE, would be remembered as Assyria's last golden blaze before the inevitable fall. Imagine a man who could spend his mornings leading armies into battle and his evenings translating ancient Sumerian tablets for fun. That was Ashurbanipal, part Alexander the Great, part Indiana Jones, with just a dash of megalomania. The first thing to know about him, Ashurbanipal was literate a rarity among kings. While most rulers of his day had scribes to do the tedious work of reading and writing, Ashurbanipal prided himself on doing it himself. He collected texts, myths, medical recipes, astronomical records, and anything else scribes could copy. His obsession turned into the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the ancient world. Thousands of clay tablets were gathered, preserved, and catalogued, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which would have been lost to history had Ashurbanipal not ordered it to be copied. Without him, we might never have heard of the flood myth that predated the Bible or Gilgamesh. Desperate search for immortality. But let's not get too carried away with the image of Ashurbanipal as a bespectacled bookworm. He was also a general who led some of the most brutal campaigns in Assyrian history. His reign was filled with wars against Egypt, Elam, rebellious states that thought Assyria was softening under a scholar king. Couldn't have been more wrong. Take Egypt for example. Ashurbanipal's father had conquered it, but Pharaoh Taharqa had clawed his way back. Ashurbanipal marched in and not only reasserted Assyrian control, but installed a series of loyal rulers, including Samtikai, who would later break free. For a brief period, Assyria and Egypt existed in a tense partnership, though partnership mostly meant Egypt sending tribute while Assyrian troops made sure nobody forgot who was boss. Then there was Elam, Assyria's longtime rival to the east. Ashurbanipal waged war against them with relentless fury. The campaigns were devastating. Elamite cities were burned, kings captured and humiliated, and temples desecrated. In one chilling inscription, Ashurbanipal boasts about taking the Elamite king's head and parading it through the streets. The Assyrian royal annals read less like sober history and more like the world's first trash talk posts. And yet, while his armies laid waste to enemies abroad, his scribes back home were cataloguing myths, omens, and hymns with equal fervor. This strange duality, books and blood, defined his reign. Of course, even the most powerful kings couldn't escape family drama. Ashurbanipal had been given Assyria by his father, while his brother Shamash-shum was made king of Babylon. At first, this arrangement worked to brothers ruling two great cities side by side. But Babylon was never content as Assyria's junior partner. Eventually, Shamash-shum rebelled, claiming independence and rallying a coalition of Chaldeans, Arameans, and even Elamites to his cause. What followed was a brutal civil war that lasted several years. Ashurbanipal crushed the rebellion with terrifying efficiency. Babylon was besieged, starved into submission, and its defenders left to die in the ruins. Shamash-shum himself perished, likely in the flames of his burning palace. For Assyria, it was a victory. For Babylon, yet another scar in its long, painful rivalry with its northern overlords. Humor break. If sibling rivalry today is about who gets the bigger bedroom, back then it was about who got to control one of the greatest cities on earth. The loser usually ended up dead. Despite all the chaos, Ashurbanipal's reign marked the high water mark of Assyrian power. From the Persian Gulf to Egypt, from Anatolia to the mountains of Iran, the Assyrian king held sway. The empire was rich, terrifying, and feared by all who lived near its borders. But here's the twist. Ashurbanipal's obsession with knowledge, while visionary, might also have distracted him from the deeper cracks spreading through the empire. His campaigns exhausted the army, his brutality fueled endless resentment, and his vast territories required more loyalty than they could realistically provide. The empire looked invincible from the outside, but inside, it was beginning to rot. Still, in his own lifetime, Ashurbanipal stood unmatched. He was the king who claimed to have read more tablets than any scribe, the king who crushed his brother, the king who left us the greatest library of the ancient Near East, and in doing so, he gave future generations not just stories of conquest, but the very foundation of Mesopotamian literature. When he died around 631 BC, the Library of Nineveh stood as his greatest legacy, but without his ruthless hand to hold it together, the Assyrian Empire was about to tumble into chaos. His heirs inherited not just a throne, but an empire stretched to breaking point, enemies waiting for revenge, and subjects eager for freedom. The empire's peak had been reached, and what comes after the peak is always the fall. The death of Ashurbanipal marked the beginning of the end, though at the time few would have guessed it. Assyria still looked powerful on the outside, its armies were feared, its cities wealthy, its libraries brimming with knowledge. But without the iron hand of a strong ruler, the empire began to unravel like a robe pulled at by too many loose threads. Ashurbanipal's heirs were not cut from the same cloth. His sons and successors, including Osheret-Leilani and Sinsi-Urishkon, were less warriors and more pawns in the deadly game of palace politics. Assyrian kingship had always been dangerous. Every throne was essentially a chair with knives hidden in the cushions. Court intrigues, assassinations, and plots flourished, weakening the royal center just when strength was most needed. The provinces sensed weakness. Vassal kings, who had once bowed low before Assyria's terrifying armies, began testing their luck. Egypt, under Samtukai, finally slipped away, shaking off the last Assyrian garrisons and reclaiming its independence. The Aramean tribes stirred again, and Babylon watched for its chance to break free once more. One of the odd stories of this period comes from reports of eclipses. The Babylonians, who were expert astronomers, believed eclipses foretold doom for kings. When a total eclipse darkened the sky during these shaky years, it was said to have thrown the entire royal court into panic. Priests scrambled to find substitutes to act as mock kings, hoping to deflect the curse of the heavens. Historians still debate whether this ritual paranoia genuinely influenced decisions or whether it was just part of the colorful folklore surrounding Assyria's decline. While omens filled the skies, the real storm was brewing on the ground. To the east, the Medes, a fierce Iranian people, were rising in strength. Once dismissed as barbarians, they had organized into a formidable power under King Cyrus. To the south, Babylon found a charismatic new leader in Nabopolassar, who declared independence and began rallying support from every group tired of Assyrian domination. Assyria tried to fight back. Of course, its armies were still formidable, its chariots still rolled, and its siege engines still battered walls. But now the enemy coalitions were stronger, more determined, and far less terrified than before. The first cracks appeared in Babylonia, where Nabopolassar not only threw off Assyrian control, but also began making alliances. The unthinkable soon happened. Babylon and the Medes joined forces. This was like two kids on the playground who hated each other, suddenly realizing they hated the bully even more. Assyria, once the nightmare of the Near East, now faced a nightmare of its own. Meanwhile, in Nineveh, the court descended into chaos and infighting. Assyrian chronicles hint at coups, assassinations, and short-lived reigns. Some kings barely lasted a year before being replaced, poisoned, or simply erased from history by their rivals. If this sounds like a bad TV drama, imagine living through it while your empire is collapsing at the borders. Humor break. You know your empire is in trouble when your enemies don't even fear you anymore. They're just arguing over who gets to burn your capital first. The rebellions spread like wildfire. Cities once loyal to Assyria switched sides, some opening their gates to the Babylonians and Medes without a fight. Trade routes broke down. The tribute streams dried up, and the once glorious Assyrian army found itself stretched thin, fighting wars on too many fronts with fewer and fewer resources. Yet, even in decline, Assyria did not go quietly. The kings who followed Ashurbanipal fought with desperate ferocity. The empire's death would not be quick, would be long, violent, and filled with last stands. One could say Assyria died the way it had lived, in battle, teeth bared, claws out. By the late 620s BCE, the writing was on the wall. Nabopolassar's Babylonian forces swept through southern Mesopotamia, while the Medes pressed from the east. Smaller powers, Scythians, Cimmerians, even some Anatolian states joined the feeding frenzy. Assyria was the great wounded lion of the Near East, and every hunter wanted a piece. Historians still debate whether a stronger king could have saved the empire, or whether Assyria had simply grown too large, too hated, and too exhausted to survive. What's clear is that the days of Assyria dominating its neighbors were over. The empire that had once terrified the world now stood on the brink of annihilation, and looming in the not-so-distant future was the event everyone remembers, the fall of Nineveh, a moment so shocking it echoed across the ancient world. But before that final collapse, Assyria would lash out one last time, fighting with desperate savagery to cling to life. The year was 612 BCE, and the storm that had been brewing finally broke upon Assyria's proud capital. Nineveh, the jewel of the empire, a city of towering walls and vast palaces, was about to face the combined fury of the Babylonians and the Medes. It was not just another war, it was the revenge of centuries, the reckoning of nations who had endured Assyrian domination and humiliation. The Medes under King Cyaxares came from the east, with their cavalry and fierce mountain warriors. From the south, Nabopolassar's Babylonians marched with their siege engines and foot soldiers. Even the Scythians, those nomadic raiders of the steppe, are said to have joined in, perhaps for plunder, or perhaps because everyone loved to see the mighty stumble. It was an alliance that would have seemed impossible in earlier times. But hatred of Assyria had a way of uniting enemies. Nineveh was not undefended. Its walls were colossal, reports suggest they stretched for miles, with towers and gates that could withstand almost anything. Inside, thousands of soldiers prepared to defend the city. The Assyrians were masters of siege warfare. They had invented many of the techniques their enemies now used against them. In a grim twist of fate, the empire was about to be destroyed by its own playbook. The siege dragged on for months. Babylonian chronicles mention battles outside the gates, assaults on the walls, and constant attempts to breach the defenses. But Nineveh held firm, at least for a time. Supplies had been stockpiled, and the defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew there would be no mercy if they lost. Then came the flood. Ancient sources, including the Babylonian chronicles and later traditions, speak of the Tigris River swelling and undermining part of Nineveh's mighty walls. Some say it was a natural disaster. Others whisper it was sabotage. Whatever the cause, the waters tore through the city's defenses, opening a breach that no army could resist. Historians still debate whether this flood was exaggerated or symbolic, but it remains one of the most dramatic images of Nineveh's fall, nature itself striking the killing blow. Once the walls were broken, the allied armies poured in. Streets that had once seen parades of Assyrian victory processions now ran with chaos. Palaces that had displayed the spoils of conquered lands now echoed with the shouts of invaders. For the people of Nineveh, it was the end of the world. One strange note from later sources claims that the last Assyrian king, Sin-Sarishkan, died fighting in the flames, refusing to flee as his city crumbled around him. Another tradition says he perished in the palace fire, perhaps by his own hand. Historians still argue over his exact fate, but either way, his end symbolized the collapse of an empire that had once ruled from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt. And what of the treasures of Nineveh? The famous libraries, the works of art, the gold and silver looted from centuries of conquest. Much of it was destroyed in the fire and sack. Some fragments survived, scattered to later generations. Ironically, the baked clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, which could withstand fire better than parchment, became one of the greatest gifts the Assyrians left to history. While the empire fell, its knowledge endured, waiting to be rediscovered millennia later. Joke break. Imagine being the poor scribe in Nineveh, carefully copying a hymn to the gods, while outside the walls a coalition army and a flood are both trying to kill you. Bad timing for writer's block. The fall of Nineveh sent shockwaves across the Near East. Neighboring peoples, who had lived in terror of Assyria's armies, now heard with disbelief that the great city was no more. Prophecies in other cultures even celebrated its downfall, calling it divine justice. It was as if the entire world exhaled at once, relieved that the iron grip had been broken. Yet the story did not end with Nineveh's fall. Pockets of Assyrian resistance survived, retreating to other strongholds like Haran. For a few more years, loyalists would continue to fight under new kings, hoping to somehow turn back the tide. But everyone knew the reality. The Assyrian Empire had suffered a mortal wound. One might wonder, could Nineveh have survived if not for the flood, if not for the unusual alliance of its enemies? Or was the city's fall inevitable, the natural result of an empire stretched too thin and hated too widely? Historians still debate this. But what's certain is that the siege of 612 BCE marked one of the most dramatic collapses of any empire in history. From being the world's most feared power to a smoldering ruin, Assyria had fallen. And yet, in true Assyrian fashion, the final act would not be quiet surrender. A last flicker of defiance was still to come, as the remnants of the empire made one final stand against the new powers rising in Mesopotamia. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE had shattered the heart of Assyria. But like a wounded lion, the empire was not yet entirely dead. In the chaos, remnants of the royal family and the army regrouped further west at Haran, a city long associated with trade, moon worship, and strategic crossroads. There, they tried to gather what remained of their once proud empire. The new leader was Ashur-uballit II, a prince who took up the title of king. His reign was fragile from the start, for he no longer commanded a vast empire, but rather fragments of territory, exhausted soldiers, and terrified civilians fleeing the ruins of Nineveh. Still, There was pride and defiance in his effort, an echo of the centuries when Assyria had ruled supreme. From Haran, the Assyrians made desperate attempts to rally allies, and to everyone's surprise, they found support not among their traditional subjects but from Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II, eager to check the growing power of Babylon and keep his influence in the Levant, sent soldiers and chariots to aid the surviving Assyrians. Imagine the irony: after centuries of Assyrian campaigns in Egypt, the old rivals were now reluctant partners. Historians still debate whether this alliance was one of strategy, desperation, or pure opportunism. But even with Egyptian support, the odds were terrible. The Babylonians and Medes pressed on relentlessly, determined to erase Assyria once and for all. In 610 BCE, they marched on Haran. Unlike Nineveh, Haran had no massive river walls or sprawling fortifications. It was a sacred city but not a fortress, and against such overwhelming force, its defense was almost impossible. When the siege began, Ashurbanipal II and his followers made a bold but risky choice. They abandoned Haran before it fell, retreating westward with the Egyptians, hoping to regroup and return. It was a strange move, some say cowardly, others say pragmatic. After all, survival meant a chance to fight another day. The Babylonians and Medes captured Haran, and with it, they effectively erased the last major Assyrian stronghold. Yet the Assyrian king did not give up. In 609 BCE, Ashurbanipal and Pharaoh Necho II attempted to retake Haran. Their joint forces advanced, banners waving, perhaps imagining a restoration of the empire, but the siege was a disaster. The Babylonian chronicles record that the attempt did not succeed, which is historian speak, for they got thoroughly beaten. During this campaign, something unexpected happened that shifted the balance of power. The Battle of Mig. On their way north to aid the Assyrians, the Egyptians clashed with the kingdom of Judah, whose king Josiah tried to block their passage. Josiah was killed, and his death became a pivotal moment in Jewish history, remembered with grief for generations. It's one of those strange offshoots of Assyrian collapse. As one empire died, its ripples altered the fates of smaller kingdoms. Joke break. Imagine trying to save the last scraps of Assyria, while also getting detoured into biblical prophecy talk about multitasking. Under pressure, the failure to retake Haran sealed Assyria's fate. By 609 BCE, the once dominant empire was officially finished. The Babylonians declared victory, the Medes secured their share of the spoils, and Egypt found itself overextended and increasingly vulnerable. Ashurbanipal II vanishes from history after this point. No throne, no palace, not even a known grave. For a king whose name meant Ashura has given life, his reign ended in silence. And yet, there's something almost tragic in how long the Assyrians clung to survival. They had seen Nineveh burn, they had fled Haran, they had begged allies for help, and still they dreamed of revival. But history can be cruel. The forces against them were simply too great. What remained of Assyrian culture did not vanish entirely. Its influence lived on in Babylonian administration, in the traditions of successor states, and even in the scattered descendants of its people who merged into the new powers of the Near East. But the empire as a political force, its iron armies, its brutal kings, its massive fortresses was gone. Historians still debate whether the Assyrian collapse was inevitable. Was it the constant overextension of their empire? Was it the hatred of subject peoples waiting for revenge? Or was it simply bad luck that a flood and an unprecedented alliance struck at just the right time? Whatever the answer, by the end of 609 BCE, the story of Assyria had reached its tragic conclusion. Still, like all endings, this one was also a beginning. With Assyria gone, Babylon rose to new heights, beginning what we now call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And in the highlands, the Medes claimed their reward, only to be overtaken later by an even greater power, the Persians. But that is a tale for another night. Joke break. The Assyrians probably thought their last stand at Haran would be remembered as a heroic comeback. Instead, it's remembered as the historical equivalent of showing up late to the party after the cake was already eaten. So, from Haran's fall to Babylon's rise, the Near East had entered a new age. The Assyrians were gone, but their shadow still lingered, etched in cuneiform tablets, carved in stone reliefs, and embedded in the memory of those who had once trembled before them. The dust of Assyria's fall settled slowly, leaving behind not only ruined cities, but also stories that would echo through centuries. By 609 BCE, the Assyrian Empire was gone, its last defenders scattered. its kings reduced to memory. Yet, in destruction, something curious happened. The world did not forget them. The Babylonians inherited much of their administrative genius. Their scribes copied Assyrian records, their rulers borrowed Assyrian titles, and their armies even adopted some of the old military formations. The Medes, too, learned lessons in conquest from their former enemies. And in time, the Persians would build upon both legacies. The Assyrians were gone, but their fingerprints were everywhere. The most enduring legacy, though, was cultural. Assyria left behind vast libraries of clay tablets filled with myths, hymns, and detailed records. The library of Ashurbanipal alone preserved texts that otherwise would have been lost forever. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to astronomical calculations. Ironically, a king known for cruelty also became the reason humanity remembers some of its earliest literature. Historians still debate whether this was deliberate foresight or simply the hoarding instinct of an obsessive ruler. As centuries passed, Assyria became a symbol in memory. To their enemies, they were cautionary tales of arrogance and brutality. To later empires, they were models of how to rule with fear and efficiency. And to modern scholars, they became a puzzle of contradictions. Ruthless conquerors who also cherished knowledge, destroyers who preserved creation. Strange details lingered too. Archaeologists once found a room in Nineveh where hundreds of clay tablets were neatly stacked like a filing cabinet, only to be baked rock-hard by the fire that destroyed the city. One person's catastrophe became another's preservation system. Joke break. In other words, Assyria accidentally invented the disaster-proof backup plan millennia before cloud storage, and yet, as the story of Assyria closes, we realize that even the most brutal rulers could not outlast time itself. Their empires crumbled, their armies perished, their cities burned, but in a way, they still live. Because we continue to tell their story. Joke break, you could say the Assyrians managed the ultimate PR trick terror in their lifetime. But immortality in history class, the fall of the Assyrian Empire did not bring peace to the Near East. Instead, it cleared the stage for new powers, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. But the memory of Assyria always lurked in the background, reminding future rulers that even the strongest walls can fall, even the fiercest kings can vanish. And so, as we close this journey through Assyrian wars and wonders, we return to the quiet truth of all history. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not armies, not kings. What remains are the stories, and perhaps that is enough. Now that the battles are done, let us slow everything down. The noise of war fades into silence, like distant thunder slipping over the horizon. The burning cities cool to ash, and in that ash, soft green shoots begin to rise. The rivers of Mesopotamia keep flowing, as they always have, steady and eternal, whispering to the earth that life continues. Imagine lying under the vast night sky, the stars glittering above just as they glittered for the people of Nineveh, Babylon, and Haran. Their empires have gone, their kings are dust, but the same constellations shine as if nothing has changed. The moon drifts across the heavens, slowly, tenderly, as if guarding the dreams of those below. The Assyrians once ruled with iron, yet even they had moments of stillness, priests chanting softly in temples, children playing in the courtyards, scribes patiently pressing words into clay. In those quiet acts, there was something human, something that survived beyond the clash of swords. That is the thread we can hold on to, the ordinary calm within extraordinary times. So let your breath slow, let your shoulders ease, and imagine the world not as a place of wars, but as a river of stories flowing gently onward. You are safe, here in the quiet, with the past behind you and only calm before you. And when you close your eyes tonight, think not of the fall of empires, but of the peaceful stars above Haran, above Nineveh, above you. Empires end, but the night sky remains, steady and comforting, a reminder that rest always follows turmoil. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be calm. End of script. Good night.